To our last presenter, I can't think of a better topic after having spoken all day about the operations of SDIOs. So we're going to be listening to Lydia, Khalil, who's here at Deakin and Lowy Institute too, who's going to be talking about harnessing civil society to combat strategic digital information operations and looking at a case study of Taiwan. Do you have a presentation as well?
Yes, yes. Awesome. Hopefully, the formatting holds up. Sometimes it doesn't, but we'll see. So thanks everybody for your patience. I'm lucky last after a very long day. So thank you for hanging on till the end and listening to this presentation, and also with your patience because this is very much at a preliminary stage in terms of the chapter's development. It's not as far along as some of the other contributors, so I thank the editor's patience for that and also for your willingness to provide some feedback at this early stage. I would particularly welcome, I think, any feedback on either conceptual or theoretical frameworks for how to situate this case study and to think about it of Taiwan. So just kind of keeping that in mind as I go along with the presentation. So I wanted to take a look at not just strategic information operations in the digital sphere, but also what we can do about them. Because particularly when it comes to Taiwan and with the CCP, you know, China's strategic information operations are very, very well studied. And so there's really nothing much that can be added, I think, at least from my perspective. So I wanted to focus on how Taiwan as a society responds to China's SDIOs, particularly its very successful and somewhat novel approaches of harnessing grassroots civil society efforts and how it's combined that with an embrace of digital technology, participatory democracy, and deliberative democracy. I was interested in highlighting this example of Taiwan for those cases because in addition to understanding how civil society can be an engaged actor in this space, it also stands in very sharp contrast with other countries' very top-down government-led initiatives to combat adversarial strategic information operations. So I thought that that's why the Taiwanese example is particularly instructive. If we could go to the next slide. So this is a very, very rough outline of plan structure of the chapter. So it's basically taking a look, first of all, setting the scene, setting the context of it, about what the CCP's strategic digital information operations targeting Taiwan are, what they are, what their purpose is, who is targeted by those within society, the various methods that they use. Then after establishing that context, to take a look at Taiwan's response in terms of harnessing civil society. So how that particular approach developed in Taiwan and some examples of countering SDIO by civil society. I also wanted to take a look at how the embrace of digital technology and deliberative participatory democracy mechanisms in Taiwan kind of feeds into the civil society approach and informs it. And lastly, I wanted to take a look at civil society government coordination, what the approaches are, elements of success, and whatever points of friction or controversy with that approach remains. And then perhaps concluding with some lessons learned or applicabilities to other jurisdictions or other contexts. If we could go to the next slide. So just very briefly for that kind of scene setting, context setting, the digital project identified Taiwan as the #1 target for foreign governments for the spread of false information during the past 9 years. So it's a particular standout statistic for Taiwan. They're the most targeted country in that, and that's probably, you know, they're ahead of the list of very many countries who are substantially targeted by SDIO. And also, according to a report that was published by the National Bureau of Asian Research last year, Taiwan also often acts as a testing ground for Chinese information operations before they then implement them elsewhere. So they'll try out something in Taiwan, and then if they find it to be successful, they'll try out that approach in Australia, Southeast Asia, United States, other areas where it directs its information operations. There's reasons why the CCP strategic information operations have been so intense in Taiwan lately, because their preferred method of kind of bringing Taiwan within the CCP fold has failed up till now, particularly after what happened in Hong Kong. the CCP's preferred method of political co-option and cultivating of preferred economic ties, they failed to bring Taiwan into the CCP fold. And so that one party, two systems framework has been discredited among Taiwanese people, like I said, after the experience in Hong Kong. So therefore, short of military intervention by the CCP, which is highly risky, and something they wouldn't walk into lightly. The CCP is now focused on cognitive warfare, that's quote unquote, and uses information operations in that effort. In Taiwan, I think the effects of this really came to the fore in 2018. It was really a watershed moment in Taiwan where they realized the full extent of CCP targeting and the effects that it was having on Taiwanese society, much like how we point to 2016, say in the United States, in terms of social media's role in the elections and what that plays. This was a very similar moment in Taiwan. And there was a few things that happened in 2018 that were particularly instructive and served as a wake-up call for everybody. One was the election of the first Kuomintang candidate to win a seat since 1998. And that party is generally pro-CCP. And it was strongly suspected that the result of that election result for a mayor in one of the provinces was because or the result of disinformation campaigns conducted by the PRC. The second thing that happened this year was the suicide of a Taiwanese diplomat who was stationed in Osaka, Japan during the tsunami. And there was a broad disinformation campaign in order to discredit the capabilities of the Taiwanese government, saying that hundreds of Taiwanese tourists had been left behind when the typhoon struck, and these accusations are based on social media that later proved to be fabricated, and that they were then amplified by politicians, mainstream media, and online influencers, and it led to the suicide of this Taiwanese diplomat. And then thirdly, in 2018, there was referendums on some very highly contentious issues, particularly around LGBTQ rights in Taiwan. And those referendums were inundated with waves of disinformation orchestrated by the PRC. Again, very much like what we've been seeing in terms of waves of disinformation that come during cycles of election and referendums, even here in Australia. And so that set off alarm bells among the general population and government, and it kickstarted these efforts to counter disinformation and countering SDIO targeting Taiwan. If you go to the next slide. So before delving into the efforts of addressing CDIO in Taiwan, I also thought it would be first useful to establish, again, some context in terms of the challenge. So what purpose do these operations serve in Taiwan? Who are the targets? How are they conducted? And here we look at a number of purposes. The first is to undermine trust in democracy as a system of government, hence making more people in Taiwan receptive to the CCP political system, which is much more about social control, authoritarianism. They also serve a purpose of persuading Taiwanese citizens to support unification, or at least not oppose reunification. Their purpose is also to ramp up concern and alarm around the threat of invasion in order to engender compliance. So it's not to basically say that the threat of invasion is imminent, but it's a mechanism to engender compliance in order to stave that off. It also, the CCP CDIO operations are often targeted with messages that undermine the faith in the United States as a Taiwan ally. Lots of information operations that talk about how the US won't ultimately come to Taiwan's defense. The last two kind of purposes of CCP SDIO operations are the promotion of CCP-friendly candidates in Taiwanese elections, we saw in 2018. But lastly, also to not just undermine trust in democracy as a system of government, but to undermine the competency of Taiwanese officials in particular. And we saw this particularly the case during the COVID-19 pandemic, because Taiwan at that point was particularly threatening to the CCP for a number of reasons. One, because it was touted as this, and feted as this international model of best practice on how to address the COVID pandemic without lockdowns and through its open and transparent information sharing. While China, on the other hand, was widely derided as being not only the source of the virus itself, but how its secrecy and its cover-up of information basically turned this into a global pandemic. So it was at that point that Taiwan was seen as quite threatening. And so during the COVID-19 pandemic, Chinese state-sponsored actors spread disinformation about Taiwan's vaccine, tried to discredit officials with fake stories around non-compliance, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of who these operations target, well, it's whole of society, like in many theaters, right? I'm sure that's been talked about a lot, but particularly Taiwanese media, because there are a number of vulnerabilities in Taiwanese media. It's not as well regulated. This is still happening, but perhaps less frequently. Taiwanese media often will, amplify stories, kind of false stories created by content farms that are then republished in Taiwanese media, amplified by state-sponsored accounts. And like in a lot of democracies and their media landscapes, they're publishing these reports because they're cheap to produce, right? Media everywhere mainstream media is under strain due to lack of advertising, pressures from social media, other revenue, and increased competition for attention. And there's also divides between pro-unification and pro-independence media in Taiwan, and that's something that seeks to exploit. And also trust in mainstream media in Taiwan is very low. It's among the lowest in the world. So for example, there was a hack of pro-independence media account after the Nancy Pelosi visit. And in response to that, the Taiwanese Ministry of Defense proposed to revise its National Mobilization Act, saying that there was a need to manage false information during a time of emergency. And according to that proposal, once that mobilization was mandated, all media would then have to cooperate with government orders, and there would be penalties for the spreading of misinformation, which was not particularly popular as well. Also, there is the smearing and targeting of politicians with disinformation campaigns, in addition to what was previously discussed particularly in the 2020 presidential elections. The CCP spread falsehoods about the Taiwanese president, again, undermining her. And then Taiwan is about to engage in another election. I believe it's in January, February. And so they're also observing a lot of disinformation campaigns during that as well. And given how active Taiwanese civil society is, an obvious target as well is undermining grassroots effort. And so if we could go to the next slide, undermining civil society is part of the CCP strategy of conducting united front work. So what is united front work? Well, according to ASPI reports on this, united front work is a strategy of alliance building, which aims to influence civil societies overseas in ways that support CCP's central foreign policy goals. And again, this graph also credited to that ASPI report. It illustrates the multi-layered whole of society effort that united front work entails. And lastly, we're also seeing how SDIO operations are evolving. So there's an emergence too of a new type of CCP influence operation. And it diverges away kind of from the traditional ones that we've seen. It utilizes all types of digital platforms, such as news aggregation, discussion platforms, rather than just planting false stories in mainstream media and social media. And there's also further changes to CCP efforts as well. For one thing, pro-unification rhetoric has declined over time, while content reporting to be from local citizens and claiming to care about Taiwanese politics and society has increased. So we've seen those changes. We can go to the next slide, please. So how has Taiwan responded, particularly to this united front work strategy? And here I think Taiwan's a really interesting case study where civil society efforts are put front and center. So as that quote reveals, Taiwan has a culture of civic participation that's been cultivated since the late 80s, when Taiwan emerged from a more autocratic system toward a more participatory democratic one. And it has kind of engendered this culture of civic participation, which is very illustrative, because there's a belief among many Taiwanese that the responsibility of countering disinformation ultimately lies with its citizens and not with its government and politicians. So there's this resistance to this top-down approach or purely government-led efforts to address SDIO due to Taiwan's more repressive history, for one, but also because of this culture of civic participation. There's also a realization that government can't control Chinese state-sponsored disinformation through excessive regulation, and so civil society has stepped in. Go to the next slide. So one of that examples of that I hope to highlight in the chapter is this example of GovZero. GovZero was founded in 2012 to promote digital transparency and establish a decentralized civic tech community to foster better information transparency, to create and to foster greater citizen participation in governments. So this was developed through close links between the Taiwanese hacker community and the Taiwanese government. And GovZero eventually led to the creation of the V Taiwan platform, which was, again, an initiative of the GovZero community. And V Taiwan is a digital participatory democratic mechanism where people can input on decisions in need of government decision. It's maintained by the government, but it's run by citizens. And it has very close links with the Ministry of Digital Affairs, which I'll come to later on in the presentation. And so while GovZero doesn't deal with countering SDIO specifically or in a direct sense, it does contribute to this culture of participatory and deliberative democracy that informs these broader civil society efforts to counter SDIO. It facilitates trust in the democratic process. And that in turn makes Taiwanese government and Taiwanese citizens less susceptible to SDIO operations, in that it is not undermining trust in Taiwanese government. So if we go to the next slide, please. And here are some other examples of some well-known civil society excuse me, initiatives. There are many others, but these are just highlighting a few examples. So one of them is this fake news cleaner. And one of the things that's kind of worth highlighting about this effort is that it's largely offline. It's made up of a number of volunteers. They target the elderly community. They do digital media workshops to help and do digital literacy workshops. And they, even though Taiwan is highly digitized, they also recognize that they have to work in the offline space, excuse me. And so Fake News Cleaner is one of those platforms that does that really well. If we go to the next slide. Another one is the Taiwan Fact Check Center, another very well-known civil society initiative. So as the slide says, it's a nonprofit, started in 2018, that watershed year that we talked about, by the Association of Quality Journalism and Taiwan Media Watch. And its efforts have been very, very popular. And they select various items to fact check on a daily basis, who are then reviewed through fact-checking personnel before publications. It's all volunteer run. They refuse donations from government, political parties, and politicians and other foreign sources in order to maintain that independence. Go to the next slide, thanks. And then the last example I'll highlight that's pretty popular is this CoFax. So it's this crowdsourced platform for the Line app, which is a popular messaging app in Taiwan. And it instantaneously responds to false or misleading messages that you can send to it to fact check. It runs on a chatbot, but it's also powered by thousands of volunteers. And again, it feeds into that ethos that it's citizens' primary responsibility, not governments, to tackle disinformation. So it's highly grassroots. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what's the key takeaway from highlighting all of these examples? Well, again, it's this embrace and cultivation of deliberative and participatory democracy that makes all of this possible while marrying them with digital technology. And it's allowed civil society to meaningfully impact and contribute to solutions to solve societal challenges like SDIO, but among others. Government efforts are also very highly plugged into and informed by civil society. Sometimes they're coordinated, oftentimes they're not, but they're often complementary. And also countering disinformation principles carried through and consistent across both government and civil society efforts. So very rarely has there been a clash between efforts. They're often very complementary. Go to the next slide, thanks. And so as an example of this, there's a kind of approach that the government disinformation coordination team, and again, this is government-led, but it's also these principles are often taken by civil society actors, and it's these kind of three principles that inform Taiwan's countering disinformation operations. One is humor over rumor. So it is, yes, while there's a lot of fact-checking going on in Taiwan, a lot of organizations that have really spearheaded that effort have come out of Taiwan. just giving people facts is not enough. It's something that they've realized. And so humor, sociality, shareability, mimification is really an important part of it. And so here's a little example of a meme that was very popular again during the COVID times that allows information that's accurate, that's timely, that the government wants to get out or to counter disinformation in a rapid way. Following on with that is this 222 principle that they come up with. So it's responding within the need to respond to disinformation rapidly within 2 hours, creating a clarifying meme like this one there with a title of no more than 20 words and messages utilizing less than 200 characters. So short, sharp, timely, that's an effective way to counter disinformation. And lastly, it's this principle of delayering. So it's about flattening the hierarchy, flattening approval processes within government or within organizations. So for these messages to go out quickly, right, in response to disinformation. So you don't have to go through various layers of approval. So that's an approach that both civil society and government have taken. Next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight the work of Audrey Tang, who is the first digital affairs minister in Taiwan. A lot of these efforts, I think, would not have been possible without their leadership. They're probably, I think they're the youngest minister in Taiwan, the first transgender minister as well. They have been extremely prominent in the international scene, is really a thought leader in these areas around digital democracy, participatory democracy, civil society. And so Audrey Tang, because she bridges that connection between civil society and is now a minister in government, has really been a key leader in moving this forward. And sometimes, you know, for these efforts to take place, you just need that level of leadership to do it. And they have the confidence of the president as well. So I just wanted to highlight that individuals are quite important to some of these efforts in terms of leadership. Lastly, I think that there's some key takeaways that we can point to, at least at this preliminary stage. You know, both points of success and points of friction that I think are important with the civil society approach. This culture of collaborative action and robust civil society is a key success to Taiwan's approach, obviously. The past history with authoritarianism in Taiwan, it spurs civic action, but it does so in a way that creates kind of a distance and a motivation without necessarily a distrust of government. And I think that's really a key distinction and an element of success. And that distance creates credibility and trust in whole of society efforts, right? And also failure is tolerated. A lot of these are successes that I've pointed out to, but there's been a number of other efforts that have not really gotten off the ground, but they've tolerated. So it kind of comes from this tech culture of tolerating failure, which is important. But there are frictions that remain, right? So they're not always coordinated, these efforts. While so far they've been mostly complementary, a lot of times, you know, there have been certain tensions between civil society and government that remain. There's also changes in the current CDI operations. There's less use of about coordinated disinformation campaigns rather than nudging interpretation of actual facts. And also there's a risk of kind of boosterism with the Taiwan case. You know, everyone is looking to Taiwan and they're saying, oh, what a great kind of example. Everybody should be applying this and stuff. And so while that's wonderful, they are a good news story. I think this risk of boosterism kind of can obscure maybe some of the more concrete lessons and takeaways that we have. And so I'll just conclude there. If you go to the last slide. Thanks very much for listening. Again, would appreciate any feedback. And yeah, hopefully I didn't keep you too long at the end of the day.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Lydia.
Lydia. That's great, Lydia. Great to hear from everyone else in the room to see how these civil society efforts would apply in the context we've been speaking about. I'm going to move to Priya online. Priya, are you there and are you happy to share your comments?
I'm here, but I don't think I didn't receive a paper, so I don't have a paper to comment on, but I guess I can say some stuff about the presentation. Is that okay?
Testing your listening skills.
Okay. Well, yeah, look, this is not my forte, but in terms of framing the paper, there's a couple of articles that I came across on misinformation in the global south, and making the point that the global south context is quite different from the global north context, and we need to actually develop models that are based on evidence from the global south rather than trying to convert global north experiences to the global south. So that might be something that you could use to frame the study. It was a really good presentation, by the way, Lydia. I really enjoyed it. The other thing is, I guess, in terms of the boosterism, this study presents a good counterpoint to the cases of Turkey and India, which also have participatory models around misinformation, but it's about, framing it as curtailing misinformation, but actually promoting a government narrative. But as I was listening to this presentation, I thought this would be, the Indian government would love this. It would give them lots of tips on how to cultivate their civil society, which is right-wing civil society, and how to use them to generate SDIOs for their political purposes. So I think that's a bit of a risk with this sort of model as well, like boostering it. Yeah, I think that's all I really had to say.
That's great suggestions.
Thanks, Priya. Khalil, did you have a chance to,
Yeah, I also,
Great.
only, my comments are based on similar, on the presentation, and as Priya said, great presentation, Lydia, thank you so much. And about the framing, well, I think this is partly certainly above and beyond just countering disinformation, and it touches the issue of protecting democracy, protecting civil society, and even protecting sovereignty. So to me, it sounds that this is conceptually, it's not limited to just some information sphere, but touches upon these greater, grander political concepts, and therefore, at least in the conceptual framework, these concepts could be there. And another thing I was interested in, again, this is only based on the information presentation, is the actual impact of these civil society activism. I mean, we saw the numbers, volunteers, and others, but is there any such a study, any measure of how successful, because obviously they can't protect the whole array of information operations coming from China. So to what extent they are successful, that would elevate the paper as well. And the other thing is that this government-sponsored versus totally independent ones that caught my attention, honestly. So is there any categorical difference between these two types of entities, these two types of initiatives? Or are they doing, so the work they are doing, are they qualitatively similar, or are they certain differences that you can discern, that we can say there are certain ones that can only be done independently, versus others can be done with the help of government? And I mean, it might sound interesting, but in a way, what the Taiwanese government doing itself is actually also an information operation, right? Because it is countering Chinese propaganda, but it's also cultivating its own group of civil society and also its own operation to counter the Chinese operations. So part of this is, there's basically government versus government. So that might be interesting. Again, this touches upon the first point about this democracy and sovereignty aspect. And finally, the theme of these discussions is the transnational aspect. And so that is, are the Taiwanese learning about this from somewhere, or are this genuinely unique to Taiwan? I think that, I know these are a lot of things, but it also came to my mind that so are they completely unique to Taiwan, or did they learn it from somewhere? I think that would be also interesting venue as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lydia.
Yeah, thank you.
Lydia, do you want to comment briefly on Lydia, on Priya and Khalil's point?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thank you. They're very thoughtful feedback based just on a presentation and not a full kind of chapter yet. So I really appreciate that engagement, even if it's just the presentation. I think that is both brought out some really interesting points, particularly looking at Taiwan as a counterpoint to Turkey and India. Priya, I think that's a really interesting thing that you pointed out. And I really appreciated that kind of taking a look at the conceptual framing around sovereignty. I think that will be very, very useful. In terms of whether this is something that is new to Taiwan or they learned it from other things, I think the point is that it is highly innovative in Taiwan, and that the Taiwan is the one that is kind of the example. They're certainly not the only ones that are doing this, but they were among the first to innovate. And a lot of the world is taking a look at what they are doing as an example of how to do that. And along with that kind of boosterism and messaging, this also is part of the counter operations as well, right? So it kind of goes to your last point. I think that would be something very valuable to point out, as well as investigating what the actual impact and evidence of this is. The initial research has pointed to a lot of literature that actually touches upon this, where there's a lack of kind of empirical evaluation on some of these things, and how a lot of it is anecdotal. And again, that goes to the risk of boosterism in my point. But I think that further investigation in terms of what research has been done in terms of the impact would be very useful to highlight in this chapter. So thank you.
I'm aware we have 5 minutes, and I do want to ask everyone if there's any questions. I'm also aware that Chacko and Isam probably want to talk about what's next. But first of all, is there any questions for the 3 papers that we've listened to this afternoon from our online audience? You can raise your hand. Hopefully, Isam will be able to see that and point to your name or in the room.
Yes, Lydia, I've got a question in regard to the citizens that are contributing to counter the misinformation. How does the government then grapple with those that might be the bad actors that come in to do exactly what they're trying to counter by doing it subtly and slowly over time?
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, and something I think to investigate in the research if that dynamic has been picked up on. One of the things that did come out in terms of my preliminary research for this paper is that this debate around the egalitarian nature of it. So for example, it was the COFACTS one. There's an egalitarianness in terms of who can respond to the disinformation. So like if I was to contribute to that, then my countering disinformation content is given as equal weight to, say, a doctor's, right? If it was about COVID misinformation. So that's a source of tension as well too, that kind of egalitarian nature and open nature of that. And I think you bring up a really good point about investigating in the research if this has been exploited in any way.
A follow on from that is looking at how large language models are trained in AI. So your job as a is coding. You get to do the coding. So I understand it's like large companies that might paying people, often in the global south, say $1, and then they're quite happy to work for $1 a day. Some will report. What happens when we get to a model like that? Who's doing that coding? And you mentioned egalitarianism. In some instances, it's children. So to what extent could they be co-opted to have a particular frame?
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I've just got a suggestion for Lydia in terms of literature. I can hear myself. Can someone mute the room? Is that okay? So there's an article that was just published in the Journal of Current Opinion and Psychology, and it sort of overviews the current literature on whether these sorts of interventions are actually effective, and it basically argues that there's no evidence to suggest that they are effective, but that might be useful for your paper, Lydia.
Thank you. I'll check that out.
Thanks, Priya. Is there any hands up online, Isan? No. All right, if there's no other questions, then Chacko has a question.
Our question for Emmanuel, you talked about, I didn't quite get what you were saying about digital media, digital technology, being good or bad, or whether it is a tool, or whether it can actually encourage authoritarian, exclusionary attitudes. Can you just elaborate? Did I miss that?
Yeah, what I was saying was digital media and the information technology and information communication has been occurring. It has contributed it, or it has had both positive and negative impacts in terms of proliferating exclusionary ideologies. This is the negative aspect. But also, it has also the positive aspect was also its ability to decentralize information dissemination, to democratize the spread of information, and to kind of the spread of information was several aspects of society, grassroots and citizens are able to share information, and they don't have to wait for the gatekeepers, the elite media, to disseminate information. This is one of the positive aspects of the digital revolution. But the negative aspect of the digital revolution also is its impact on social cohesion, its impact on the spread of fake news, misinformation, exclusionary ideologies, racism, and discrimination, and as we have seen it during the COVID pandemic period, where minorities, including Asian migrants, Africans, and Middle Easterners and other people, have been targeted by racism during the COVID pandemic period. So those aspects, I'm trying to look at these two as the positive and the negative aspects of the impact of digital media. Thank you.
Lydia has a follow-up question, I think it's good.
Yeah, please, if that's okay. And also a question about the paper manual. It seems like digital platforms are kind of treated in aggregate, that it's just like one type of landscape. And I'm wondering if you've kind of taken a look at how various digital platforms differ. Because, Facebook is different than Twitter versus others. And then while those platforms, there is a lot of evidence for this exclusionary nationalism that you identify. There's also other digital platforms where the opposite is happening, where they are more inclusive, where there are various other affordances that don't promote these things. So kind of in addition to treating digital platforms as one phenomenon versus kind of separate entities with their, wondering if you're also taking a look at what particular affordances and socialities are existing on these platforms to contribute to this national exclusionary nationalism that you identify. And then a last question, if I might, too. How are you differentiating between, say, exclusionary nationalism and just like hate on these platforms, or extreme views, or racism? Is there a difference in terms of the two concepts?
Yeah. So, for example, in the when we talk about the racism, we are specifically talking about, we conceptualize racism as exclusion and bias and discrimination, prejudice based on race, color, skin color, national origin, and other forms of identity. But when we talk about exclusionary ideologies, we are talking about the discrimination, including xenophobic nationalism and nativism and other forms of exclusion. But with racism, this aspect. But in terms of the digital media, you're right. We distinguish between mainstream media and different social media such as Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter, and other forms of social media. We distinguish between those, but we did not delve into each and every aspect of social media or mainstream media. But it's the right comment.
The other thing that might be useful too is to take a look at some of the writing on social media logic, comparing it with mass media logic, and how that kind of interplays with some of the dynamics that you're trying to tease out in the chapter.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just want to add a quick comment on how we, what's the word, put silos on digital platforms. Even as we watch now, there seems to be blurring. For example, what we used to call normal media or whatever the mass media. But also if you look at the social media network, what's happening is, let's say CNN or ABC or one of those major ones. But they also are in other social platforms. So all of a sudden, you might be reading the New York Times and there could be something in Facebook or Instagram or somewhere else. So it's almost merging. So it's very hard to even tell what is social media or what's the mainstream media. So you just have to be really careful about that as well.
And in the alternative media literature, social media is not necessarily classified as alternative either. Need to make a pretty strong case for that as well. Any other questions? If there's not, then I'm going to wrap up this session, this panel, panel 4, last panel, intergroup relations, social cohesion and civil society, and hand over. Chacko, do you want to make some final comments about?
Yes, I want to make a very important comment. We have not taken a group photo. If you were in Indonesia, you would have already taken 100 million photos. That's something I learned in Indonesia. You gotta take photos. If you don't have photos, it didn't happen.
Okay, so it didn't happen.
So just a thank you, right? Just a thank you to everyone for your contribution. Amazing papers. Ihsan has been frantically organizing the whole event, so I don't want to take credit for what's been going on. But we are going to move towards a publication.
Yes.
So Ihsan is going to tell us all about the publication.
Yeah, I'll send you an email soon. So we have a soft deadline, 15th of February, but it is a soft deadline.
Don't tell them it's a soft deadline.
Yeah, but they know I'm soft. So, because it's summer holidays, and I've just checked my emails, just only 4 months ago, we decided to have this seminar. I had a chat with Shahram and he said, yes, we should do it. And then we worked on the call for papers. Khalil helped a lot. And then now as well. And then we had the flyer, and only 3 months ago, we publicized it. And in 3 months, and we had, I think, great response, 16 presentations. More than papers I've received. So I think it's a great outcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And you also helped us as discussants and chairs. It's a great sacrifice. Thank you so much.
Everyone, you have to work for your lunch, you know?
Yeah, so it was a very, especially today, it was very intense and it was good. I enjoyed a lot. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. And we will be in touch.